Every semester, students at SDU deliver excellent assignments on various topics. They demonstrate that they have the relevant skills needed to analyze questions of relevance to researchers and business practitioners. In 2021, students worked on an assignment that aimed to explain what motivates firms to trade with or invest in specific foreign markets. In the following, we will present findings from 5 student assignments at SDU using quantitative research methods. This assignment is provided by Alina, Annika, Leah, Lisa Anna, and Miriam Sophie. They analyze trade as a foreign entry mode.
We are going to present you our assignment using factor and regression analysis to understand trade as a mode of foreign market entry. The agenda for today looks like this. We would like to start with an introduction and theoretical background. Then we are going to present you our hypothesis, the factor and regression analysis, interpretation of our results, and in the end, we will talk a bit about our limitations and future implications. Now I will start with the introduction. As I said before, in our assignment, we wanted to analyze the mode of entry with the help of a factor and regression analysis. We have focused on the area of trade and therefore selected trade, percent of GDP, as a dependent variable. In the article by Johansson and Wallner, the 2 authors explain that the traditional Uppsala model from a modern perspective and show what they call this chain of establishment in empirical studies of internationalization. This chain of establishment indicates that a company starts its internationalization by receiving orders from foreign markets. Then, as export increase, it enters into a relationship with a distributor or an agent. Then it establishes its own sales organization, often followed by local manufacturing. So in our assignment, we wanted to start right at the beginning at the stage of trade. For our theoretical background, we also wanted to use the article of Holmes et al. And Jankov et al. We reviewed various indicators and examined how they affect trade. Through a factor analysis, we were able to subdivide the various indicators into 3 factors. The factors that emerged we called regulatory institutions, political institutions, and border compliance. Now I would like to go more into detail how we develop our hypothesis. We wanted to empirically examine the impact of taxes on the entry mode trade. Holmes et al. Describe that taxes on certain value-added activities for foreign firms can influence firms and individuals to take fewer of these activities and or to relocate to locations where taxation is more favorable. We also wanted to examine the influence of political institutions on trade. Holmes et al. Described that managers of MNEs often limit investments in countries with autocratic political institutions because these autocratic political institutions tend to facilitate instability and unpredictability in the institutional environment. Border compliance, in particular smooth and rapid import and export across national borders, is crucial in the area of trade. Jankov et al. Described that more efficient trade facilitation stimulates trade, and at the same time, trade is also likely to generate improved trade facilitation. Crucial factors here include the volume of trade at the ports and time-saving techniques such as computer-assigned scanning of containers.
So based on the theoretical implications, we derived 3 hypotheses. Our first hypothesis is taxes raised by regulatory institutions have a negative impact on trade. Our second hypothesis is stability in political institutions has a positive impact on trade. The last hypothesis we derived is complex border compliance has a negative impact on trade. I'm proceeding now with an overview and our approach to the factor analysis. We are first going to formulate the problem whereby we specify the objective of the factor analysis and the variables to be included in our model. We then proceed with performing the factor analysis and are going to compute and test the correlation matrix. In the following step, we then extract the factors following a priori determination. The last step in our approach is the rotation and interpretation of the factors, which will then be used in our regression analysis. As Leah already introduced, we based our analysis on the articles of Holmes et al., Djankov et al., and Warner and Johansson. According to these articles, dependent and independent variables were chosen. The table is including our dependent variable as well as our 13 initial independent variables with data from 217 countries. The chosen variables were here already grouped in 3 factors: regulatory institutions, political institutions, and border compliance. Our dependent variable is trade in percentage of the GDP. The measurements we chose were based on data from the World Bank. All data is from 2016, since for this year, most of the data was available. Using a conformity approach as well as a trial and error method, considering the factor loadings, we selected in total 6 independent variables out of the 13 initial variables and used them later on to perform a linear regression analysis. Due to missing data for our variables, for some countries, we limited the number of countries to 192.
The second step of the factor analysis includes the computation of the correlation matrix. The Kaiser-Meyer-Okin criterion is an index that compares magnitudes of the observed to partial correlation coefficients. The criterion is used for the evaluation of the correlation matrix as a whole, and the KMO score should be greater than or equal to 0.5. In our case, the KMO criterion is 0.598, what can be considered as miserable. For the Bartlett's test, we wish for a p-value below the desired level of alpha. Since this is the case for our data, we can reject the zero hypothesis, which says that the variables of the population are uncorrelated. The anti-image correlation matrix shows the negative partial correlations between 2 variables. Furthermore, the diagonal provides the measures of sampling adequacy on the level of individual variables. The MSE values should be greater than or equal to 0.5 as well. In relation to our independent variables, it can be seen that the values for taxes on international trade and taxes on income are below 0.5. The next step of our analysis is about extracting the relevant factors. We focused on an a priori determination, which means that the number of factors extracted is based on prior knowledge. The 3 factors extracted, namely regulatory institutions, political institutions, and border compliance, explain 93.28% of the variables of the variance of the original variables, and therefore bundle over 90% of the original information. Factor number 1, the regulatory institutions, explain most of the variance in our model, more precisely 32.9%. We further analyzed the rotated component matrix, which contains the factor loadings of all variables on all factors extracted. The factor rotation helps to find a clearer assignment of variables to factors. The correlations between the variables and the factors extracted were all above 0.8. This indicates that they are highly correlated. After considering which variables have the highest factor loadings on each factor, we could say that taxes on income and international trade refer to factor 1, control of corruption and government effectiveness relate to factor 2, and time to import and time to export can be assigned to factor 3.
We can now come to the regression analysis, where we start with formulating the problem and then go on to estimate a specific model, check the model and coefficients, check the regression assumptions, and finally interpret the results. With the findings of our factor analysis, we could formulate the previous mentioned hypothesis and build up the regression model to explain our dependent variable trade in percentage of GDP by our 3 independent variables: political institutions, regulatory institutions, and border compliance. The coefficient of determination R square, first of all, shows how much of the total variation in the dependent variable is explained by our independent variables. As you can see, 16.1% of the variance of trade is explained by our 3 factors, which is not very high and could be increased by improving the model.
Nevertheless, it is not a problem, and we could go on with checking the significance of the model by using the F-test, which tests if there is a linear relationship between all the independent variables considered together with the dependent variable. With a p-value of 0.000, the model does explain a significant portion of the variation in trade, which means that there is evidence that at least one independent variable affects trade. By using the t-test, we can now check the significance of the individual regression coefficients. So if there are relationships between the independent variables and the dependent variable, which significantly differs from 0. In our case, political institutions and border compliances are significant predictors as their p-values are below the defined level of significance of 10%. This means that there is evidence that both significantly relate to trade and linear relationships exist. Regulatory institutions as the third predictor is, however, not significant as its p-value is above 10%. Looking at the standardized coefficients, we can see that the most important driver for trade are political institutions with a beta of 0.302. Border compliances have the second highest but negative impact on trade with a beta of minus 0.235, and regulatory institutions have the smallest and also negative impact with a beta of minus 0.114, which was also not significant.
I'm going to continue to check the assumptions of the regression analysis, and therefore we are having a look at the test of multicollinearity, and we are going to check the variance inflation factor. As the variance inflation factor is lower than 5, we can say that we do not have a problem of multicollinearity. This means that the information is not redundant. On the right side, we can see the test for non-constant variance, whereby we are having a look at the scatter plot. We could identify errors against the dependent variable, which means that some amount of homoscedasticity can be found. This indicates that relevant determinants are most probably missing. Furthermore, we are having a look at the test for normally distributed errors, and as our sample size is above 50, we use the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, and we can see that the result is significant, thus the null hypothesis can be rejected. This means that the errors are not normally distributed, which can be seen in the histogram on the right side. And in the following, I'm going to interpret the results. And first of all, we're having a look at the hypothesis 1, which was taxes raised by regulatory institutions have a negative impact on trade. And this hypothesis can be rejected. And therefore, regulatory institutions have not a significant negative impact on trade. However, political institutions and border compliance have a significant influence on trade, which means that hypothesis 2 and 3 can be confirmed. Thereby, the main influencing factor for trade in our model is political institutions. Last but not least, I'm going to have a look at the limitations and future implications. Thereby, the scatter plot reveals a pattern, what can be an indicator for missing determinants and information. We tried to improve the model by adding further variables, but the dispersion of the dots in the scatter plot did not change. Furthermore, when analyzing the results, it should also be considered that our errors are not normally distributed. And moreover, we needed to exclude 25 countries due to missing values. And now I'm having a look at the future implications, and it is recommendable to consider further variables for the different factors to improve the overall model. And decision makers who consider trade as a foreign entry mode should especially take the control of corruption and the government effectiveness in the foreign market, as well as border compliance into consideration according to our results. Thank you very much for listening.
I hope you enjoyed watching. Feel free to get in touch in the case of any questions.